There are moments that define who we are, and mine came on an autumn afternoon. While I was stuffing my clothes into an old backpack, I could hear Brandon's laughter coming from the living room. My older brother had always been the perfect kid in my parents' eyes, even though he dropped out of 3 colleges and never held a job for more than 2 months. My dad's words still echoed in my head. On your 18th birthday, you're out. Just like that. No party, no hugs, no regrets. My mom just watched in silence, as she always did when it came to me. The clock read 5:45 p.m., and in 15 minutes, I'd have to leave the only home I'd ever known. The sound of the TV left on, and the smell of dinner that would no longer be mine filled the air. A reminder that some families are just people who share the same last name. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. I spent my entire life trying to understand why my parents treated Brandon and me so differently. While my brother got a car on his 16th birthday, I got a $5 card. When Brandon wrecked the car in an illegal race, my parents bought him another one. Accidents happen, they'd say. But when I asked for money for a photography course, the answer was clear. Learn to be responsible with your own money. In high school, Brandon could go out whenever he wanted. I had to work part-time at Mr. Peterson's diner, just to earn my own cash. It's good to learn the value of hard work early on, my dad used to tell me, but only to me. Brandon never had to learn that kind of lesson. Family gatherings were especially hard. My mom would show off Brandon's participation medals from school competitions like they were Olympic trophies. My A's? Just expected. When I earned a partial scholarship to the state college, my dad just shrugged. A week later, they threw a party to celebrate that Brandon had finally decided what course he wanted to take, for the 3rd time. Richard and Margaret, my parents, had a special talent for making everything seem normal. The differences in treatment were subtle to everyone else, but they cut deep for me. Brandon could sleep in, while I had to get up early to help out with chores. He got an allowance. I got growth opportunities. It was as if there were 2 different families under the same roof, and I clearly belonged to the less favored one. My 18th birthday morning went exactly as expected. I left my parents' house with a backpack, $300 I'd saved from working at Mr. Peterson's diner, and an old mattress I managed to load into Mr. Peterson's truck, which he kindly helped with when he heard about my situation. I found a tiny apartment on the far side of town. The smell of mold was constant, and the heater only worked when it felt like it. The peeling wallpaper revealed moisture stains, and the neighbors seemed to compete daily over who could make the most noise. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had a space that no one could take from me. So long as I paid the rent, of course. To make ends meet, I picked up a second job at a bookstore. My days started at 5 a.m. at Mr. Peterson's and ended at 10 p.m. at the bookstore. Between shifts, I barely had time to eat a sandwich. My feet ached all the time, and sometimes I nodded off during my lunch break, sitting on a park bench near the bookstore. Money was always tight. After paying the rent, bills, and buying food, there was practically nothing left. I learned to work miracles with instant noodles, and developed a knack for finding supermarket deals. I bought my clothes from thrift shops, and even learned to sew a bit to make small repairs. Meanwhile, through social media, I saw Brandon living it up in college, posting photos of parties and trips paid for by our parents. Occasionally, he'd post family dinner photos where everyone smiled as if nothing had happened, as if I'd never existed. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the apartment was deafening, and loneliness weighed heavier than physical exhaustion. I tried to convince myself that it was only a temporary phase, that all this effort would pay off someday. But there were moments when I wondered if I'd ever have a normal life, if I could ever get more than just surviving. It was on one particularly cold night that I met Scout. I was coming back from the bookstore when I heard soft crying coming from an alley. I found a shivering golden retriever curled up behind a dumpster, trembling and clearly malnourished. His fur was dirty and matted, and he had a look just as lost as I felt. Even though I barely had enough to feed myself, I couldn't just leave him there. I slowly approached and offered him half of my dinner sandwich. He ate it with so much gratitude that my eyes welled up with tears. After a few minutes of careful coaxing, I saw he was wearing a collar with no ID. I took him back to my apartment, promising myself it would just be for one night. I gave him a makeshift bath in my tiny bathtub, using my cheap shampoo. The apartment smelled like wet dog afterward, but for the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. One night turned into a week. I named him Scout, inspired by the book I was reading at the bookstore. I shared my food with him and made him a little bed out of old blankets. Scout instantly became my family, greeting me with joy every night no matter how tired or down I was. I reworked my tight budget to include dog food and basic care for him. I even figured out how to save a little more at the supermarket by buying cheaper brands for myself. Scout never complained about the long hours he spent alone in the apartment. He always waited patiently for me. His presence transformed that meager space into something closer to a home. During our morning walks, before my shift at the diner, Scout seemed to know the neighborhood inside out. He always tugged his leash towards an old residential area in town. I resisted at first, worried he might belong to someone there, but deep down I knew I'd have to check it out. The idea of losing my only friend scared me, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone was looking for him. One Sunday morning, my one day off, I decided to follow the path Scout always pulled for. He led me to an old red brick house with a well-kept garden, despite the chilly weather. My heart sank when Scout started barking excitedly upon seeing the house. Before I could decide what to do, the door opened. An elderly lady appeared, wearing a light blue robe and leaning on a cane. Her eyes widened when she saw Scout, and she put her hand over her heart. "Maxwell!" she exclaimed, and Scout tugged on his leash so hard that I nearly fell over. The lady, who introduced herself as Eleanor, invited me inside. Her house was cozy, filled with old photographs and furniture that told stories. The smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air. We sat in her living room while Scout, or Maxwell as she called him, lay down at her feet like he had never left. Eleanor told me that Scout had gone missing during a storm 3 weeks earlier. She'd searched everywhere, but with her limited mobility and age, she couldn't go far. Her eyes filled with tears as I explained how I'd found him and taken care of him. Instead of simply taking Scout back, Eleanor surprised me. She asked about my life, listening intently to every detail I shared. I don't know why, but I felt comfortable telling her everything. About my parents, Brandon, the 2 jobs, the shabby apartment. She didn't offer pity, just understanding. "You know," she said, pouring me another cup of tea, "Scout has always been good at judging people's character. He must have seen something special in you." Then she made an unexpected proposal. We could share custody of Scout. She needed help walking him, and I could visit as often as I wanted. Eleanor had been living alone since her husband passed away 5 years earlier. Her children lived in other states and rarely visited. I realized she was as lonely as I was. We agreed that I'd take Scout for a walk every morning before work, and on Sundays, we'd spend the day together. That afternoon, just as I was about to leave, Eleanor insisted on giving me some containers of homemade food. "You're too skinny," she said with a motherly smile, "and no one should live on nothing but instant noodles." I tried to refuse, but she wouldn't accept no as an answer. I went back to my apartment with a smile on my face, even knowing I wouldn't have Scout by my side every night. Something more important had happened that day. For the first time since leaving home, I felt that I'd found someone who truly cared about me. No strings attached, no expectations. In the fridge, I arranged the containers that Eleanor had given me. Each one had a handwritten label with the contents and reheating instructions. It was a simple gesture, yet it meant something I had never experienced before: genuine care. While savoring a serving of her homemade lasagna that night, I realized that sometimes the families we choose are better than the ones we're born into. Visits with Eleanor and Scout quickly became the best part of my days. During our mornings together, Eleanor taught me how to make her favorite dishes while sharing stories from her youth. She had been a literature teacher for 40 years and owned an impressive library from which I started borrowing books regularly. As the months passed, our routine naturally fell into place. In the mornings before work, I'd walk Scout around the neighborhood. Eleanor always insisted I join her for breakfast: eggs, bacon, and pancakes she prepared, saying she needed to make sure I was eating properly. On Sundays, we'd spend hours in her garden, where I learned about gardening and taking care of the roses she'd nurtured for decades. Eleanor began helping me in subtle ways that went beyond food. When I mentioned I needed nicer clothes for my job at the bookstore, she found some old shirts of her late husband that needed a new home. When she learned I was studying during my breaks at work, she rearranged a vacant room into a study area for me. In return, I'd do small repairs around her house, help with the grocery shopping, and accompany her to her medical appointments. On nights when she wasn't feeling well, I'd sleep in the guest room just to ensure she was okay. Scout slept between our rooms as if he wanted to take care of both of us. Our bond deepened when Eleanor came down with a bad flu. I spent an entire week caring for her, making soups according to her recipes and reading her favorite books aloud. During that time, she showed me an old photo album and shared that she had lost her only baby boy before adopting her other children, who now rarely visited her. Sometimes, she told me one night while we sipped tea on the porch watching the stars, Life takes something important away from us to give us something even more precious. Her eyes lit up as she spoke, and I realized she wasn't just talking about her own story. On my 19th birthday, Eleanor organized a small celebration. She made my favorite cake and gifted me an old camera that had belonged to her husband, knowing of my interest in photography. "Talents shouldn't go to waste," she said, also handing me a prepaid registration for a local photography course. That night, sitting in her living room with Scout at my feet, I realized I'd found something in my new home that I'd never had in my original one: unconditional acceptance. Eleanor never tried to change me or compare me to anyone else. She simply welcomed me as I was, offering the kind of motherly love I had always longed for. Scout, who had brought us together in the first place, seemed happier than ever with the two of us. He developed a sixth sense for our moods, always knowing exactly who needed his attention at any given moment. Between affectionate licks and playful moments in the garden, he helped us create our own quirky yet perfectly functioning family. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning. Eleanor didn't answer when I knocked on her door for our usual walk with Scout. I found her unconscious in the bathroom. She'd suffered a stroke during the night. The next few hours became a blur of ambulances, hospital corridors, and endless forms. I spent every spare moment at the hospital, juggling work, study, and caring for Eleanor. Scout stayed at home, but every time I returned to feed him, he'd sit by the door waiting for his owner to come back. The doctor said the stroke was severe, affecting a significant part of the left side of her body. During the first few weeks, Eleanor fought bravely. Even with the difficulty speaking, her eyes still shone with that special light whenever I entered her room. I read her the same books she used to read to me, held her hand during medical procedures, and learned from the nurses how best to help her. After much negotiation with the hospital administration, I managed to bring Scout for a special visit. Eleanor's face lit up when he walked into the room. For a few moments, it felt like things might go back to normal. Scout gently lay down next to her bed, as if he understood he needed to be extra careful. One night, while I was alone with her, Eleanor managed to muster enough strength to speak more clearly. She gripped my hand with surprising force and said, "You gave me something I thought I'd never have again, a son to love." Her words hit me like lightning, and for the first time since I'd known her, I cried in her presence. In the days that followed, her condition worsened rapidly. The doctors explained that complications had arisen, and her body wasn't responding to treatment as expected. Eleanor, even in her weakened state, maintained a serene dignity. On one particularly hard afternoon, she asked for paper and a pen. With trembling hands, she wrote, "Take care of Scout. He chose well." On the last night, I stayed by her side, holding her hand. We communicated through looks and gentle squeezes, a language we'd developed over those weeks. She seemed at peace, as if she knew her mission in this world was complete. Eleanor passed away in the early hours while I dozed off in the chair by her bed. Her face was serene, almost smiling. The hospital room, which had become so familiar over the past few weeks, suddenly felt cold and strange. I went home that morning with an immense emptiness in my chest. Scout immediately sensed that something was wrong. He sat beside me on Eleanor's porch, the place where we used to spend our afternoons, and rested his head on my knee. We stayed there for hours, sharing a pain that words couldn't express. In those moments of mourning, I realized that Eleanor had taught me more about love and family in our short time together than I had learned in all my years at home. She showed me that family isn't just about blood ties. It's about the daily choices of love and care. A week after the funeral, I received a call from the law firm Harrison and Associates. Eleanor's lawyer wanted to see me urgently. I walked into the sleek office feeling out of place in my best clothes, which still seemed entirely unsuited for the environment. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, a gray-haired man, greeted me with an expression that mixed seriousness with something that looked like admiration. He opened a folder and began to read Eleanor's will. With every word, my heart pounded harder. Eleanor had left me everything: her house, her savings, her books, and official custody of Scout. She updated her will 3 months after meeting you, Mr. Harrison explained. Eleanor left a letter explaining her decision. Her other children were informed and, according to her instructions, will receive a small share of the inheritance. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. I went back home, now my home, in shock. I sat in Eleanor's favorite armchair with Scout at my feet and opened the letter with trembling hands. "My dear son, if you're reading this, it means our time together has come to an end. Don't be sad for me. You brought more joy to my final months than I ever thought possible. When Scout brought you to my door, he wasn't just coming home. He was bringing me the gift I needed most. You might wonder why I chose to leave everything to you. The answer is simple. Because you gave me something money can't buy. True, selfless love. You took care of me and Scout without expecting anything in return. You showed more character and integrity than most do in a lifetime. The house is now yours, along with everything I saved over my life. Use these resources to follow your dreams, study photography, travel, do everything your parents never allowed you to do. But above all, keep being the wonderful person you are. Scout is officially yours now, though I believe he'd already decided that long ago. Take care of him as I know you will, and remember, sometimes angels come with 4 paws. With all my love, Eleanor. In the following weeks, I learned that Eleanor had left behind a considerable bank account, investments, and a fully paid-off house. Mr. Harrison helped me navigate all the legal aspects of the inheritance and guided me on how to manage these resources. The house, already a special place, now carried new meaning. Every room held memories of our time together. I kept everything just as she left it, only converting the guest room into my photography office. The roses in the garden continued to bloom under my care, as if Eleanor were still watching over them. Scout adapted quickly to the new routine. Every morning we'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, just as we used to do with Eleanor. In those moments, I could feel her presence, as if she were smiling down on us from somewhere. The news of my inheritance spread quickly around the small town. In less than a month, I got a call that I recognized immediately. My mom. Her voice sounded sweet, almost unrecognizable compared to the coldness of recent years. She mentioned how much she missed me, and how the family wasn't the same without me. The next day, my dad called too, talking about letting the past go and rebuilding family ties. Brandon posted on social media about how family is everything and how he was excited to reconnect with his little brother. It was surreal to see how money could so quickly change their perspective about me. They showed up unannounced on a Sunday. I watched from the window as they got out of the new car, bringing along an apple pie, my favorite, according to my mom, even though she never got my true taste right. Scout growled softly beside him, something he rarely did. "Son, we need to talk," my dad said, trying to sound paternal. "Your mom and I made mistakes, but we're still your family." My mom added, "Maybe we can be a family again, all together." Brandon, sporting his rehearsed smile, commented on how nice the house was and that we could have family reunions there. I realized they were already thinking about how they could benefit from my new situation. I looked at the photos of Eleanor on the wall, at Scout lying in his favorite spot, at the book she had shared with me. I thought of all those mornings of genuine care, of the heartfelt conversations, and the unconditional love she gave me. "No," I simply replied. "You're not my family. Family isn't something that shows up just when there's money involved. Family is who's there in the tough times, who loves without conditions, and who accepts without judging." They tried to argue, but for the first time in my life, I felt completely confident defending my position. I told them to leave and not come back. As I watched their car drive away, Scout rested his head on my leg, just like he always did when I needed support. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this. Today, 2 years later, my life is completely different. I finished my photography course and opened my own studio in town. The studio walls are decorated with photos of Scout and Eleanor's garden, my very first and dearest inspirations. I've kept the house exactly as Eleanor liked it, with the books organized by author and the roses always well cared for. On Sunday mornings, I still make pancakes using her recipe, and Scout still waits for his special piece, just like she used to do. Recently, I even started teaching photography classes to underprivileged youth in the city. It's my way of continuing Eleanor's legacy, helping others find their way, just like she helped me. The money she left me allowed me to set up a small foundation that offers scholarships to students who need a chance. Scout's older now, with a few gray hairs on his muzzle, but he still has that gentle heart that led him to me in that dark alley. He still sleeps in the same spot between my bedroom and Eleanor's old room, as if he's still watching over both of us. Sometimes, when I'm sitting on the porch on autumn afternoons, with Scout by my side and a cup of tea in my hands, I feel Eleanor's presence. It isn't a sad feeling. It's comforting, like a silent hug. She taught me that family isn't determined by blood, but built through love, respect, and mutual care. I've learned that sometimes you have to lose one family to find another, and that the strongest bonds are the ones we choose to create and nurture. Eleanor and Scout showed me that, and for that, I'll be forever grateful. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like to get access to more stories like this.